number 2, declarations of interest. Does anyone have anything they'd like to declare? No, I don't have a declaration of interest, but I would like it noted that I'm a resident in a council property myself, so just putting that out there for transparency. Nothing else? Okay. The third agenda item is chair's announcements. I'm acting chair. I don't have any announcements on my end. I don't know if Lizzie would like to come back to this once she's here and add any on her end. But we'll just move on to the next item, which is moving on to discussion items. The first one's agenda item 4, which is the HRA 40-year business plan. We have here Councillor Smith, hi Linda, thank you for joining. And we also have Peter, Neris and Lourdes. Linda, would you like to introduce the report and then the officers can kind of add in after you? Is that okay?
Yeah, I was going to hold back really, and I think the more, there's 3 very meaty reports on the agenda tonight, which taken together, represent massive changes to the way that we run housing services. So I think the more that you hear from the officers with their expert and professional overview, the better. So I'll hold back for now, and I look forward to listening to what the panel's got to say and joining in the conversation later. That's okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Shall I?
Yeah, Peter, do you want to start, or Lourdes, or Neris?
No, I'll start. Thank you, Chair. Right, so we've got 3, as Councillor Smith has said, weighty reports, and I think this is a preamble. I think it's worth saying that the reports come out of a series of work streams that we've been undertaking over the last year. And the reason we've been undertaking these work streams, which has, in a sense, taken a comprehensive look at how housing functions are delivered in the city. But that really stems from the major challenges that housing faces at the moment and going forward. And fundamentally, I think there are 3 big areas of challenge. One is the continuing difficulties and pressures to deal with growing homelessness and our TA, temporary accommodation, and the costs associated with that. And we took a report to Cabinet in July that set out that position. The second is around the new, tougher regulatory regime around the HRA, which to some extent is responding post-Grenfell and Awad's law around damp and mould and the condition of Awad's stock. And a third, which I think is going to be a prevailing challenge for us, is the strong emphasis being placed on the tenants' voice and engaging tenants in housing. And then underpinning all of that is that basic problem or fact that we're all dealing with, which is that money is extremely tight. And I think taken together, that was the backdrop for us to review the totality of how we deliver the housing functions in the city. And what we have today are 3 related reports, and I will talk through the first one, and then we'll hand over to Lourdes and Neris. So the first one is the HRA 40-year business plan, and I'll assume everyone's read it, so I'll just give the summary of this. The business plan, in a nutshell, it's a requirement that all housing authorities prepare a HRA business plan. And the purpose of that is to demonstrate that the HRAs will be healthy, well, are and will be healthy going forward. And that was the requirement of government at the time the budgets were delegated. And so the important thing for the council in regard of having this report is that it is demonstrating to the public, but importantly back to government, that we believe that based on the work we've done, the HRA is in good financial shape. And that's crucial that they are able to see that. So what it does and how it does it is by way of modeling the expected income into the HRA over 40 years against the expected expenditure against the HRA over that same period. And so that's essentially the modeling. And in that regard, the inputs, your income and your expenditure, must be planned. It must be real, in other words. So the income assumptions going into this model are based on the budgets that Cabinet will be considering in December as well, in terms of the income into the HRA and the planned expenditure from the HRA at the December Cabinet. Those numbers have been fed into the model, which have then been forecast 40 years on. So that's essentially what the HRA modelling does. And in the case of Oxford HRA, what we and the plan does do is confirm that the council's plans for delivering its services to tenants and maintaining and securing its council's stock over the next 5 years, which is in line with the MTFP, they are affordable. And that's the crucial statement that any government, not any government department, the Ministry of Community and Housing will be looking for. Is your plans affordable? So that's the first thing we are able to confirm, that the 5-year plans are affordable. The second thing it must show is that over the lifetime of the plan, the 40 years, that the plan is healthy, as it's termed. And that really is saying that in terms of the level of debt on the plan over that 40 years, that we believe will have sufficient operating surplus to repay our debts. And I think by demonstrating that, it would be said that your plan is healthy. And so the second thing this plan does is to confirm that the plan over the 40 years is in good health. There is a blip, I think, in years 28 to 31, where we fall below the ICR guidelines for a 3-year period. Yeah. But then once we come out of that 3-year period, the plan improves, and the financial health of the plan improves, and surpluses are generated to the end of the 40-year period. So I'll come back to that blip in a minute, but overall, it is classified as a reasonably good health plan. What we then looked at is, well, can we improve that position as it currently stands? And there are steps that the council can take to improve that position. And we've set out in the report some actions that we're proposing to take, which will actually improve this. And improving in this case simply means, can we get out of that dip into the ICR? And so that's one factor to take into account. The other factor, which we were not able to confirm in the modelling at the time of the modelling, was the rent increase policy assumptions. And that's because that only came out in the Chancellor's statement. So we have, however, asked the researchers to do an addendum report for us, a very short note, just to say, what is the effect now of the Chancellor's policy announcement that rent increases will be CPI +1 for another 5 to 10 years? And what we're saying in the report at the end, by way of conclusion, is that if you then take into account the additional steps that we're saying we should take to improve the position of the plan, plus the rent policy changes announced by government, we will no longer fall below the ICR level. So the plan will stay healthy throughout the period, and we do not dip into that unaffordable period area for any period of time. The other thing it does then show is that after that 2030 period, the plan then does generate surplus to the end of the program. And we estimate that from 2030 to 2040, up to around 700 million in borrowing headroom could be created in that way. So overall, it's a healthy plan. I think the thing I would say, relative to the HRAs of many other councils, this is a very good position to be in, because not many councils are finding it that they are able to balance the HRA at the moment. So this is a very good position to be in. And I think that's essentially what the plan is proposing, and it is asking Cabinet to adopt the plan and to agree to the steps that we proposed in the plan for improving the baseline even further, and for us to start thinking about the future planning and investment options beyond 2030.
Thanks so much, Peter. Neris or Lourdes, would you like to add to that?
Yes, shall I go next?
Oh, sorry, have you not finished, Peter?
No, I have. I think Lourdes was about to go into her report. I don't think we should do that yet, Lourdes.
Is that part of agenda item 4? Is that with the same report?
No.
Oh, okay. I think what the plan is to keep each kind of report separate. So do the report presentation and then take questions and then do the next one, if that's all right.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. Thank you so much. Can I ask whether panel members have any questions on this report or any comments? Yeah, Councillor.
None so far, Chair. None so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mundy. Lizzie, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, sorry, I failed to put my Zoom hand up. First of all, apologies for my lateness. I was actually going to be on time until I took a wrong turning and ended up on the A34 in the wrong direction, which was fun and terrifying. But I have sort of, because I know that it's kind of a balance between the investments for the medium term and longer term, and also making it balanced financially. And I wondered what kind of consideration has been given to potential changing standards of which might necessitate further work, whether that's kind of factored into the risks at all in terms of the balance. So, for example, if the government, I don't know, changes, I know we can't plan for all of this, but changes regulation around a particular thing that means that our housing infrastructure needs further investment, for example.
Yeah, so that is what I would call a what-if scenario, which you cannot model into the plan. Now, but having said that, and it's the right question, the process for HRA business plans therefore requires that you look at your business plan every year. You don't review the plan, you don't redo it, but you update it every year, just in case assumptions have changed, in case new spend requirements come along, and capturing the kind of scenario that you've just mentioned. So there should be a quick look at it every year.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
None from me, thank you. It was very helpful.
Okay, thank you. I had a question, but Lizzie just covered it. It was in regard to flexibility and how much there is, but it's good to know that it does come back, it's reviewed every year. Does that mean that this scrutiny panel reviews it every year, or is it just internally in your team that does the annual review?
It should be an annual review, because by rights, there shouldn't be much change in that 5-year period, because that 5-year period is based on your MTFP. Yeah. So unless there have been significant known changes, it shouldn't trigger a fundamental change to the HRA. So officers should have a look at that situation. Has anything changed? And if things have changed, it'll be modelled and then it will come back to members. But generally speaking, it doesn't change annually in that way.
Yeah. Okay, that's reassuring. And Councillor Dickens, I think you have another question.
Yes, and apologies, I'm not sort of the numbers and finance stuff. I'm continuing to get my head around. So this is, if my questions are silly or don't make any sense, just say. But what happens if, so there's obviously a relationship between the debt and the HRA capital programme. What happens if some of our houses don't get built, or we miss some of the capital programme out, or things get held? I know it's a what if scenario, but things get held up for certain reasons. What happens then? Is there some kind of level of risk or kind of slippage built into the plan, or not really at all?
The slippage wouldn't be built into this plan, but if we follow the scenario you're raising, so if you take the house building program and there is slippage, that program in itself will need to take into account the implications of the program on your house building. And so that would be set out here. Would it change the HRA business plan? Not necessarily, because what the HRA business plan has done is to take into account the expenditure required by the house building program, and it has been allocated. If there is a significant delay, and I think this is why when officers look at this annually, they need to understand if the delay is so significant that it would reduce the amount of supply coming on stream significantly, then yes, because that would affect the rental income. Equally, if the program is delayed significantly, would that affect the expenditure required by the program? Will they need more money? And I think, again, it's down to the scale of the impact that will determine whether there's a need to review the HRA business plan in that way. And so by annually reviewing it, officers will have to judge very quickly if the impact on the business plan is minor, in which case leave it alone. If it is significant, then it will be remodeled slightly, and then the answer will come back to members.
Can I follow up through you, Chair, if I may? Is there sort of is there a procedure or a process of some kind for that annual review? Does that come as a formal report? Is that more of a iterative process? How does that work?
I think so in my experience, the formal process only kicks in if it is determined that there is a significant impact, which means that there must be changes to the HRA. Because if there hasn't really been any impact, there's no need to do anything. So it really comes down to the scale of impact, whether it triggers more decisions from Cabinet. And the decisions that it may trigger is so if you take the example you just gave in terms of the house building program, if the house building program was delayed, etc., required more funding, then clearly the house building program would go to Cabinet to seek additional funding. Where we would look at this in terms of how much additional expenditure is the house building program seeking, will that change our affordability of the HRA business plan? If not, there's no need to change the plan. But clearly the house building program will need a report to Cabinet to say we are running late, we're delayed, etc., etc. Costs have risen, we need X more, so that the money can be allocated. But it won't necessarily impact significantly the HRA business plan over 40 years. So it really comes down to the scale of impact. If officers, having reviewed this, believe that there have been significant changes which does materially affect the health of the business plan, then that does trigger a report back to members.
Yeah.
And one final question from me is actually just on that point before I ask my kind of off-topic question. Is there any value, do you think, in making it clear at what the threshold would be for triggering that, or is it so situation specific that wouldn't make much sense?
The latter, I'd say, and because equally, I think there are markers in the business planning process that says, in the HRA 40-year business planning, that says, oh, something significant has happened. So, for example, if I go back to the ICR, if changes had occurred, which meant that the ICR fell below, then that does take you in unaffordable territory. You would actually review then. So it has to be significant. The other thing I should say is that this should also be aligned with your budget setting process. And so finance and the HRA business planning process are synced, they should be synced. And so the triggering will come from that dynamic between what's happening on your budgets, finance, MTFP. Does that actually signal significant changes to the income or expenditure on the HRA to the extent that it materially changes the business plan? So I think through the finance budget process, there are the natural signals and triggers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have more questions?
Yeah, one final question, and thank you for sort of answering all those and making it very clear. I think in the report it says so you've obviously got the addendum with the assumption of rents rising CPI plus 1.
Yeah.
I can see that there's also, I think, if I read this right, the assumption that building costs will rise CPI plus 1%.
Yeah.
Is that in line with assumptions that other people are making across the country? Is how was that figure? Because I know that they're volatile or particularly just spiking or have been over the past few years. How was that figure arrived at?
So in terms of building costs, I think the prudent assumption we're making is that you should always factor in that your building costs will rise in line with inflation. The +1 seems to be good practice at the moment, that people tend to add +1 to the building costs. The rental income is set by government. It's the government's policy on rental income. And because they have now said that they will actually extend rent policy to CPI +1, that's why we've adopted it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments? Councillor Mundy.
Thank you. Have we calculated in the plan what the financial repercussions would be if rents were to increase by CPI alone without the +1? Just as a form of comparison, because obviously that +1 is still going to make a difference to the tenants. Just so I have an idea of what we're talking of in terms of impact on the HRA account. Thank you.
I think the answer is yes, but I'll explain it. So we have modelled in relation to rents that rents will increase by CPI +1 up to 2026-7, because that is existing government policy. We can only model what is, okay? And the assumption that we made in the main report was that following or after 2026-7, we'll revert back to CPI, which is actually inflation-led. So that modelling is our baseline, and so we know that. The fact that the government has now said it will keep CPI +1 for another 5 years, that is what the addendum report has modelled. So we do know the difference in impact between CPI and CPI +1 in terms of the total income that we're modelling going forward. Yes, we do.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions or comments from the panel? No. I don't believe there were any recommendations per se. Is that right, Celeste? Or I don't think we have any official recommendations from the panel. We just had a selection of questions. Is that right?
At the minute, not formally, but I would suppose ask the panel if they have any recommendations to put forward.
Would the panel like to propose any recommendations to the report?
No, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that seems like there's no recommendations suggested. Thank you then, Peter, for a comprehensive report and presenting it really well and taking questions. I think we can move on to the next item. Is that right, Celeste? If there's no recommendations.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, perfect. And the next agenda item is 5. But now that Councillor Diggins is here, I think she can officially take over as chair again if she would like to. Is that okay, Lizzie? Yeah, perfect.
Thank you so much for chairing my absence. So item 5 is the HRA asset management strategy and 5-year investment programs. Linda, would you like to say a few words of introduction and then pass on to officers, or happy to just pass straight on?
Yeah, happy for Lourdes to launch straight into it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, councillors. So my report, this report comes at the back of Peter's report in relation to the HRA's business plan context in terms of the financials. It supports and puts in governance, management arrangements and measures to help the effective management of the HRA business plan. It also puts measures and arrangements to position Oxford City Council in readiness for an inspection as well. So putting arrangements in place by forward planning and putting a 5-year investment plan. And I would say it's the first one of OCC, as well as the asset management strategy. So very briefly, I assume everyone's read the reports. So in brief, the 3-year asset management plan, really what it does, it sets out the foundations to enable the council to make long-term approach to planning and looking after its stock, essentially. The asset strategy was based on using a survey where tenants were asked questions about what the priorities were for asset management and how they would like to see the asset looked after and what their priorities were within that. And the asset strategy, as well as the 5-year investment plan, reflect those priorities, and those are set out in the reports. The asset strategy is based, sets out 6 priorities for actions, focuses on governance and putting measures in place for the council to be able to know and understand what the assets data is, make better decisions, have better governance arrangements for how it makes decisions on assets, but also taking into account the tenant's voice, and making better decisions around the stock that are better and fit for the future, as well as taking into account the council corporate priorities, for example, carbon, zero carbon, thriving places and communities. So that's broadly what the asset strategy is trying to do. It's trying to put governance and management arrangements to look after and make decisions for its assets. Moving on briefly onto the 5-year investment program plan. Again, very much based on the stock condition survey in response to the what tenants told us what their priorities were. We also used a lot of data that existed within the housing department in relation to what we know about our assets and the information and the work that has been done to the assets as well. as well as looking also the energy efficiency, improving the energy efficiency of the stock, and where we needed to do work in those areas. Sorry, I've got bad cough, so I was going to cough and I'm trying to hold it back. So then looking at all of the data, then we prepared a capital program and a revenue program. The plan program basically is broken down in area priorities. So these are very much aligned with also what the consumer standards, this is the social housing regulator requirements are. So based off all the work that we need to do in relation to safety and compliance, and that comes to the work that needs to be done in the next 5 years, and based on what the stock condition told us that we needed to do. Works on street properties, obviously you have a lot of those, as well as works that needed to be done on blocks and flats in relation to the priority work that needs to be done in those areas, as well as on energy efficiency and other areas. Then looking at that, then it's what does that program look like, and what is the cost of the program? So that basically gave us a total capital program over the next 5 years of up to 77 million to be commissioned directly to ODS as the council in-house company, and 100 million to be obviously subject to the HRA procurement policies and procedures to be contracted out. And then a revenue program of annual for 12 million to be commissioned annually internally and commissioned via ODS, which making a total program of approximately 77 million over the next 5 years. And then very briefly, in terms of looking at the delivery of the program, is again also putting together the measures and governance arrangements that will effectively make sure that we are getting good value for money for the works that we are commissioning, not only ODS, but also the contractors that we would be commissioning to deliver the works over the next 5 years, and asking for some arrangements to be put in place, and arrangements during the first year, which we're calling it as a transition and delivery year. So being a better client from a client perspective, being more specific about what we want, how much we want, where we want it, and when do we want it. So all of that program will be very clearly defined in relation to all of those areas, and making OCC a better client, and working better with ODS to make sure that they are delivering better value for money in the works that they deliver. Then we also have looked at how we are commissioning and client managing, particularly ODS, in how the work they're delivering, and then putting very clear measures in what those client arrangements need to look like by having strategic and operational meetings, performance measures, and putting all of the different arrangements that currently exist at the moment, but some of them need to be improved, some of them need to be introduced. So for example, being very clear about what kind of specifications we want, for what works we want, at how much and where. So again, repeating what I've just said earlier on, is becoming a better client for OCC, so we can actually monitor what they're delivering, and that they're delivering better value for money, but ultimately better outcomes for the tenants. And then in broad terms, those are the commissioning arrangements and the client arrangements, which are attached to the report as appendices. So you can see what those details are within that program. And then it asks a set of recommendations, which is basically to approve the program, the 177 million, and then approve the responsive program as well of 12 million, and also to approve the appendices, which are the commissioning works, the client management arrangements that will go as part of the bundle of commissioning the works to ODS, and the arrangements that we need to put forward for contracting the work that will be non-ODS. I think that's provides the outline of the report. Is very meaty and dense report, so I hope I've given the salient points.
Thanks very much. That's really helpful. I'm going to ask if any councillor, unless anyone else would like to add anything from the officer side. Oh, yeah, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, my mute. Oh, am I off? There's just one quick point I just want to add, which ties it back to the HRA report, because I think it's really important and it's within the report. So one of the things we said from the HRA 30-year business plan is that money is tight, and quite clearly one of the actions we've recommended in that report to improve the financial health of the HRA is that we secure greater efficiencies in the delivery of our repairs and maintenance and so on. And so this report, which Lord Ez has outlined very well, at the heart of it is that there will be the introduction of efficiency savings annually, but we recognise that in order for ODS to be able to deliver those efficiencies, we need to provide them the certainty of a 5-year programme, and also the certainty of a clearer, appropriate commissioning and clienting arrangements. So we will be seeking efficiencies, but recognising that we need to create the conditions that will enable ODS to deliver on those efficiencies.
Thank you. Any further comments from officers before we get started on any questions? Any questions from committee members, questions or comments? Okay, not seeing any. Well, I've got a couple, but I just need to find where they are in my PDF. Think so. I'm looking at the section of the report that is the asset management plan and strategy, where it's got sort of the headline actions and then the detailed actions section. One of the, and this might just be because it's kind of a figure that's current. I wondered what our current, so in ensuring every voice matters, action point 2, detailed actions, is that clear enough as a description of where I am? Yeah. It's sort of talking about setting targets, and it's got the targets as 70%. And I wondered what currently I probably know, is currently the number of respondents who report they're satisfied with the overall service from their landlord is. Does anyone know what that current is?
I'm not.
Sorry.
Sorry,
I couldn't find my hand. Sorry, Councillor Diggins. According to last year's survey, I'm going to say it was either 72, 73%.
Yeah.
And we are currently.
Yeah, that met my.
Sorry, Lizzie.
Oh, was that? Yeah, was that my internet that went a bit funny?
Yeah.
Actually.
You're back now.
Sorry.
Shall I try again? So I think it was about 71 or 72%, Councillor Diggins, and we are actually out at the moment with our sort of full survey to tenants. So we will sort of, in the early new year, have a sense of whether of what the current situation is. Yeah.
I just, and maybe this is, but I wonder if we could be, because I feel like 70% is, I wonder if we could be a bit more ambitious in our targets, or whether that doesn't fit, because they're all set at 70% currently. And I think we're already not just meeting, but exceeding that. Could we be more ambitious, or is that not sort of the point of this section?
I'm trying to find the section.
I'm on page 80 of the report pack, 22 of the asset management strategy, asset management plan, 2025 to 2026.
Yes. So can I add to your question, Councillor? So 72%, and yes, absolutely. Oxford City Council should be ambitious and should be aiming for much higher tenant return, in other words, in terms of survey. I have to say, I was looking at all of the tenant surveys across the country, and I would say in comparison to other relative landlords to Oxford has very high return for tenants. So I think that's already very good, but it's something that you need to be ambitious to try and get more returns from the tenant engagement. And I think that really lends itself from the next report that you will be getting from Neris in terms of how do we engage with residents, with tenants, to engage more with the council and engage on the work that the council is doing, and be more involved and be aware about what the council is doing for tenants in terms of its landlords. So engaging and communicating more, so then we can actually get better and more engagement and involvement for the work that we do, and they are more informed as well. So I think that there are opportunities there that we can capture as a council to try and increase that tenant survey return and have better engagement and a more satisfied tenant return as well as part of this process.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's, I know that our current sort of return is really great, but it's just, can we, if we're doing this work to kind of improve things as well, could we sort of push that a bit further? And then then sort of jumping through the report to the commissioning to the demand-led sort of work programme. So how kind of, I mean, obviously, if it's demand-led, sure, can we be that's the limit of the demand-led work that will be needed? I know there's been a lot of work done on voids recently, and it's my understanding that demand-led voids fall under demand-led work, and they can be very, very expensive. How is that sort of factored into that figure, and how can we, I mean, I feel like demand-led often feels like a long series of what ifs, to borrow this phrase. So how does that kind of square up?
Yeah, so demand-led, yes, absolutely, voids falls into that category. Adaptations and repairs, for example, it also falls into that. And one way of looking at it is obviously you cannot predict demand, because demand is always affected by what is currently going on in the housing climate at that moment in time. But also you can also project different things that can happen in people's lives, or what's happening in the housing landscape, in other words. So you can project demand, for example, more people needing adaptations, for example, because as a result of people living longer and needing more help and et cetera in their home, so their homes needed to be adapted. Helpful also to look at data, the previous data of adaptations that are being carried out, the causes and the reasons and why, and possibly do predictions as well. I think there is an aspect in here in some areas is also doing better joint working as well. So understanding what is causing the demand is really, really important, particularly on repairs. So if you've got a huge number of demand, for example, on damp, and we know that this is a very topical area. Why is it? Do we need to do something specific and more dedicated, and take it out from a responsive and move it to a more planned, so we can manage better the finances, we can respond more proactively in doing the works around those areas. So I think it's looking at each thematic area of works, looking back, looking forward, looking at the context that we are operating and what's happening in those areas. And also a really good thing is also looking at the data that we have from tenants, what tenants are telling us, and this is definitely something that the regulator wants us to do, to be more engaging, so we can actually start doing more dialogue and be more proactive about planning works in our tenants' homes rather than being a reactive, because obviously we know that reactive is more expensive. So there are a number of factors that really can be done to help manage the reactiveness, help manage the finances as well from that.
Thank you. And oh yes, Councillor Smith.
I was just going to say that I think it's important that there's delegations in place as well to allow officers the flexibility to move budgets around within that that budget as well, because what we've seen sometimes is there's unprecedented demand, unexpected demand in one area. Say we have a year when there's like loads of gales and all the fences fall down and we're spending more in that area, but then there might be another area where we're underspending, and officers need the flexibility to be able to manage budgets appropriately. But yeah, just echo what Lourdes said about the whole idea of having the planned investment programme, is that we need to do less and less of this responsive work because we're on it before it happens, and keeping our properties in tip-top condition.
And I mean, I know this is covered in the report, but I just guess a bit more of a sense of how that transition period will be managed, because obviously currently, presumably you're doing a lot of reactive works because you don't have the capacity or the time to necessarily be doing the kind of proactive stuff.
Yeah.
So how is that, and kind of do you think the timing and how do you think those things are going to play out? Do you foresee any kind of bumps along the road there?
Yes, it's going to be challenging, and I think the report recognizes that nothing will be done overnight. But there are two things that need to happen. We need to make sure that the business continuity and the work that needs to be done continues, and that is not disrupted, because we don't want our tenants to suffer from work not being done as well in the properties. But equally, what we need to do is we're going to be, and this again mentioned in the report, that we need to program the work that needs to be done. We are looking at the resources within the service as well to make sure that we have the resources and the tools and the means to carry out the work that needs to be done across during the transitional year and across the service. That is going to be a program that I have been asked to develop, and then we were going to be apportioning the work, and as we move forward in terms of delivering the work, we will be introducing the different measures as part of the transition. So for example, if we are going to be commissioning kitchens in certain properties, we will then be taking the opportunity to be clear about defining and specifying what kitchen, where are the kitchens, what kind of kitchens, at what cost, and where. So again, doing that work as we go along and being more specific and taking the opportunities that gives us to include those changes that we want to include. So when we end the year, we have delivered and developed the new arrangements, and that going forward into year two, and some actions will straddle across year two, because I'm not saying everything is going to be completed by end year one. There will be some things that will straddle across year two, but the idea is that year on year, as the annual program, as the 5-year program is reviewed annually as well, alongside the HRA business plan, as Peter said, that these things are moving in the right direction and they're effectively managed. So you're managing your finances, you're managing what you need to do, when you need to do it, and you have better control as well as to the quality and the work that the tenants are receiving as ultimately, because that's really what it's about. It's about making sure that the tenants are receiving the works that they need at the right time when they need it.
And just finally, is there a plan for, because I know there are some tenants who the stock condition survey may say your kitchen doesn't need replacing for another 5 years.
Yeah.
From the tenant's perspective, it needs replacing now.
Yeah.
And that's not always going to that you're not always going to be on the same side of that conversation.
Yeah.
Is there a plan for how to kind of, also from the engagement strategy side of things, is there a plan for how to address?
Yeah, so as part of the 5-year investment plan, most of the components will have a life cycle, but we do accept that some things, you know, may break or need replacing earlier than expected. That's where you have your the point that Councillor Linda just mentioned, that there will be some things that if they need to be done, they will get done. And for that, we will then go out, we will survey, we will understand what's happened here. And then if we need to replace a kitchen or a bathroom sooner than the life cycle shows us, then we will need to do that. And it will be factored in within that program as well. But the idea is that as we move to doing everything more in a planned approach, is better ultimately and more efficiently for the council.
Oh, and sorry, I said that was finally for me, but I've got one more question. It says, so currently about 40% of the properties have had a stock condition survey. And when did that, I mean, I may have missed this, and apologies if I have. When did that process start? And how realistic do you think it is that that's going to be done by March 2025? And are there any properties where there are some real barriers to undertaking a stock condition survey, and is there a plan in place as to how to manage that?
So I started in June, but I understood that the stock condition survey has started early this year. So I have been in place and I've been overseeing the stock condition survey. And I know so far we are now nearly up to 70% of the stock condition survey. So we are on track to completing the stock condition survey. In relation to properties that have been identified that, you know, they are in urgent need of works, and it depends on the level of works that's needed. So there are some properties that might need, you know, significant works. Then obviously they will be looked at differently and separately. So major works or major voids, for example, those will have their own separate budgets, and work will be more dedicated and planned to be done in within the program, but separately. But we are looking at all of the properties where where the worst are in need of improvement first. But equally, we also want to package everything to be done in a more cohesive way. For example, if a property needs the door replacing, and if the communal needs painting and decorating, and if the kitchen and bathroom needs to be done, ideally we would like to do everything in that block, again, because of more efficiency purposes.
Thank you. Councillor Mundy.
Thank you. I just wanted to talk about some of the targets that we've got as part of this plan, and in particular in relation to the satisfaction targets for different metrics that are detailed there for the tenants. And obviously we've had the tenant satisfaction survey recently, and I know it wasn't altogether bad news, but it also wasn't putting us among the sort of best performing authorities when it comes to the satisfaction of our tenants. And I guess that's going to point to why some of the targets that we have are, you know, arguably a little bit sort of low, I guess. I mean, you know, we do have targets on the sort of 65-70% mark in terms of satisfaction with repairs and with the sort of placemaking, I think it's called, supporting thriving places and communities, with a satisfaction target of 65% for the percentage of respondents who are happy with the contribution to the neighbourhood. But my first sort of question about that is, when we say satisfied, are we talking, you know, with the sort of the typical response options of very satisfied, satisfied, and then you get to your sort of neutral one, and then you get dissatisfied and very dissatisfied? Are we talking 65% of respondents saying they're either satisfied or very satisfied, which isn't that brilliant if 35% of them are dissatisfied or very dissatisfied, or are we making a target for the sort of most satisfied responses? And are we, I guess, quite, in sort of very basic terms, are we being ambitious enough with that? And is it, as is suggested, are we sort of targeting performance that's among the best authorities in the country in relation to the tenants? Thanks.
I think we've kind of covered off the second and third of those questions earlier on in the discussion. And that might be something that comes out of our discussion as potentially a recommendation about looking at those targets and again. But I think the first point about how that survey is undertaken, but that might be one more for, I don't know, Neris, unless Lourdes, you can cover that one.
I can answer some of that. Neris may want to add to it as well. What I do know is that the tenant satisfaction measures are part of the social housing regulator requirements. So they're very strict in terms of in law in how the lines of questions need to be asked to tenants, and how they need to be analysed as well. I'm not sure about how the commissioning was, or the company that carried out the survey on your behalf. So maybe Neris can add a little bit more to that. Apologies, I wasn't here for that area of work.
Yeah, just to add to that, so the commissioning of the survey is completely aligned to the that very strict definition in the TSMs. So those will be aligned to, on that basis. Yeah.
Yeah. I suspect that the point, sorry, I'm not sure if I'm on, there is a degree of standardization in terms of the carrying out of tenancy surveys. And if we look at the big survey companies, they have in recent years worked with the emerging regulator in working up the Social Housing Act. And so there is a standardization in terms of the way questions are phrased and the way they are collated. And the reason for that is to enable comparison across local authorities of the responses. And I think, going back to the specifics, I think it is generally on the basis of, are you satisfied, very satisfied, or dissatisfied? So I think that is the standardization, and I think it's necessary that we stick with that in order to have the comparator across local authorities.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments? Not seeing any. So I might sort of suggest that recommendation sort of that made about looking at those targets and thinking about whether we could push those further, particularly around tenant satisfaction, might be sort of just looked at to think about kind of if we're already meeting them, is there a way that we could push those up further? And oh yes, Lourdes.
No, all I just wanted to add that the social housing regulator has now issued the full response of all the tenant satisfaction measures across the country. They issued them yesterday. If you wanted to see them and benchmark yourselves against all the others. But one of the things that has come out very clearly from the feedback from local authorities is that to increase tenant satisfaction, the ones that have achieved the highest satisfaction has been those that have invested on face-to-face surveys. So, which is a big question mark because most local authorities are saying that they don't have the resources or the finances to do that. So it's something that each local authority may want to consider. But again, I just thought I added to see if it's something that Oxford may want to consider going forward as well. It's just as an aside.
Thank you. That's really great. And I just also picking up Linda's point as well, is that flexibility that you were talking about baked into this report, the sort of delegation to officers of moving money between budgets, particularly within the reactive side of things.
Shall I answer it?
Yeah.
Shall I answer it? Sorry, I can't see anyone on screen.
Yes,
okay,
please, Peter.
I think the answer is yes. And I think it's one of the things that we've looked at quite carefully is actually whether there were the right delegations in place. And I think what we've done is to ensure that, going back to the point, if we're trying to manage demand, that's one thing. But in order to manage demand, the officers need to have the levers to be able to, as Councillor Smith said earlier on, move the budgets around, because there'll be certain areas, voids is a good one, where demand levels are always going to be high. They may overshoot what you'd actually plan to do. What do? You may have to actually take a decision to spend more in order to cope with the level of demand. But you need to do that by managing an overall budget. It does mean, therefore, that you will need the flexibility to reduce spend in other areas where demand may not be high. So that is baked into the revised commissioning and clienting arrangements that we've proposed, as well as the financial management arrangements of which we've proposed, working with Nigel and the finance team. So yes, I think broadly is the answer to that question.
Fab. Maybe we could just brilliant. In which case, if there are no, sorry, Councillor Smith, go for it.
Yeah, no, it's just a query really that I've got in relation to the tenant satisfaction discussion. It's my recollection that we have a target elsewhere, whether that's in the corporate strategy or housing and homelessness strategy or somewhere. But we already have targets around tenant satisfaction where we're looking to improve on that consistently. Does someone want to remind us about that? Because I can't quite remember where it is. Thanks, Neris has got a hand up.
They're in the corporate strategy, they're corporate KPIs where we're showing some small stretch exactly in line with this discussion on those targets. They're not dramatic stretches. I think it's sort of from 70 to 72 to 75, you know, over a period of time, reflecting the work that all of this bundle kind of seeks to achieve, really, but also acknowledging a broader kind of context of some dissatisfaction as well. So they're not huge stretches, but there is a stretch in the corporate strategy.
Yeah, I think that's the proper place for it, you know, where to focus on that continuous improvement, perhaps rather than this document, but that would just be my opinion.
I mean, I wouldn't mind just putting a recommendation in to just see whether those two documents should be brought in line, but then you are obviously free to come back and say we've looked at it and no. So if we could sort of make sure, and if no one's got any other recommendations or final thoughts before we move on, in which case thank you very much, and thank you to where am I? Everyone, I think everyone's staying on now for the last one. Is that the case? But if not, then have a lovely rest of your evening.
If I may, Chair, if I may be excused.
Yes, Peter. No, okay, fantastic. In which case we're moving on to the tenancy engagement and management item. So
sorry, Chair, I think Lourdes was just saying that she's not needed for this section, so I think we can say good night to her, can't we?
We can.
Yeah, that's who I was waving to.
So. Okay, there was lots of faces happening on the screen. I got quite confused. I'm really sorry. Thank you so much for answering all our questions and introducing the report. And have a lovely rest of your.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
In which case, moving on to the tenancy engagement and management item. Inviting Linda, if you'd like to introduce this, or Neris, or pass straight on to Neris if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm happy to let Lois go for it.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Smith. Okay, so this is the last in the bundle, and I think in we set the strategic financial context. We've dealt with the assets really in Odez's kind of report, and this final report of really deals with our people. If we can think about it a little bit like that. So it's a report that really focuses on our tenants, or particularly on the reset of our approach to tenant engagement. But it also does talk about the reorganisation of landlord services and our tenancy management functions as an authority, and how we need to evolve and change that service as well, so that we are compliant with the Social Housing Act, etc. So the report essentially talks a little bit about some of the background about one of the really key outputs really from the Grenfell report was around
You've frozen on.
the strengthened tenants, and that is really reflected in the Transparency, Influence and Accountability Consumer Standard that sits within the Social Housing Act. So it's essentially, it sets out a new approach in this report of how we would engage with tenants. Can I just check you can hear me okay? I'm just being told my internet is unstable. Is it okay?
You okay now?
Oh, it's okay now, yeah?
Yeah.
In the middle, but I think Zoom did the thing for me where it speeds up and tells us everything you said in super speed.
Oh, okay. Okay, I could always pick up any questions, yeah. But essentially, what it does is set out a new approach to tenant engagement. It tackles some of the issues that we've identified as part of a sort of desktop survey. So we need to have clearer governance structures for how tenants engage with us. We have a requirement, obviously, to engage. We need to communicate and update a lot of our performance data to our tenants in a better way. And as part of that, we will also need to develop quite a wide-ranging tenant engagement strategy, of which some of this governance work will sit within. And yes, essentially improve our engagement across a number of different platforms. So it makes some recommendations about what that governance structure should look like. And then the latter part of the report talks about our landlord services reorganisation, which we are looking to get underway in the new year. And it sets out some of the outputs and outcomes of that work in terms of, well, tenant engagement is one area, but responding to our tenants' needs better is a key area that we need to focus on. We need to look after our estates better, provide better jobs for our staff, and improve our kind of ICT and digital kind of offers. And it looks to package all of that in a reorganisation piece of tenancy management. So we will be looking to kind of get that work underway in the new year. And I think that really sort of summarises really that the purpose of this piece of the bundle, and brings together that people and the focus on our tenants. So I'll pause there and take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions from? Oh, yes, Councillor Rule.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I welcome this paper and appreciate the energy going into reviewing this quite holistically and taking quite a comprehensive approach. I had some interest in the governance structure in particular, and just an interest in particular for why like the Young People's Forum is seen separate to being a tenant group and not represented on the kind of the forum representative group, I suppose, recognizing it's sort of another interest group in a similar way of a different age demographic that I would, as I understand it, is usually quite underrepresented in our response to surveys on tenant engagement. For example, younger people obviously moving around a lot more frequently, and therefore a lot of these systems being new and not knowing how to engage with them, I think, to me, makes it feel like an even more important demographic to try and engage and reach, because it's so underrepresented in our usual processes and in current context. And I also had a kind of related question just about how to understand the specific groups in the structure as they currently sort of sit at a floating level and aren't integrated in, or perhaps I'm not understanding how they link. And I'd be interested also in how the how the task and finish groups operate and what kind of makes that distinct, being a task and finish group compared to like a specific group. So just an understanding of the groups, how they relate, and then particular emphasis on the young people, if that's okay. Thank you so much.
Sure. So in terms of young people, it's interesting if we look at our demographic. You know, the proportion of, say, you know, it depends on how you define young people in some ways, but from 16 to 25, let's use that as an example. We have a very, very low number, actually, of 16 to 25-year-olds. That's not to say that their voices shouldn't be represented, but if we then compare that to, say, older people, I mean, you know, I can't quite remember, never remember the statistic completely, but about 60% of our whole tenant base is now over 65. So there's quite a big disparity in kind of the volume of people in both categories. And obviously, older people have a significant amount of vulnerabilities that we really do need to kind of understand in the mix. So at the moment, Young People's Forums, I think we need to evolve our thinking a little bit more about how we engage young people. And of course, the other thing to just reflect, you know, and this is open to comments and change as well, is young people might not want to engage with us in the same way. You know, we may need to evolve our mechanisms for engaging young people. You know, they may not want to come to meetings, etc., in the same way as our older tenants tend to prefer. But that is part of what we need to do in the new year when we go to the roadshows, is engage and understand how people want to engage with us. So I think that could evolve and change further. And I know Councillor Smith was very keen to ensure that young people's voices were reflected in the governance structures. Yeah. In terms of some of the specific groups at the bottom, these are just examples, Councillor Roll, of some of the areas that we know we need to focus on. So performance, tenant strategy and tenant safety are really, really key. That's not to say that there wouldn't be others. And it also means that we do also need to consult our tenants themselves on this structure and whether they are happy with the structure overall, and whether they would also like to make other recommendations in terms of what the specific groups are that we pull together. But there are some that I think are really important. We've shown those in terms of, you know, for example, compliance and safety, I think is a really key one. We must provide a very clear platform on that front. And we would really like our tenants to engage with us initially in a task and finish way on developing the strategy. Once that strategy is evolved, you know, we might sort of close that task and finish element down and, you know, that we could move on to implementation. So maybe those are two examples of how we envisage it working.
Any further questions from other members of the committee? Okay, not seeing any. I think just picking up on one of those points, when you're thinking about a young person's forum, is that where, and now this might betray some ignorance on my part of exactly how this works, is that where they're kind of one of the lead tenants, or is that where, for example, you've got a younger person living in a multi-generational household?
Yes.
My intention was very much, it was about young people living in our council homes, living on our council estates, not necessarily, you know, having the tenancy themselves. And hearing from them, you know, particularly when we're talking about improving estates, using HRA money to fund youth ambition programs, you know, all of that area work. I think it's really important that we hear from young people and, you know, benefit from what they've got to say about it. But I'm also thinking about it from the point of view of, you know, I think it as something that's empowering for young people, and actually a good experience and a good opportunity to offer young people living in our homes. You know, some other councils have a youth council, which sort of is a sort of a mirror of the actual council, and, you know, is used as a body that can be consulted with, you know, and I think we don't have that in Oxford, but you know, perhaps this could maybe be a bit of a trial run for that as well, in terms of allowing young people in the city, you know, living in our council homes to get more involved with the work of the council.
Councillor Rule.
Thank you, and thanks for the responses, and appreciate that there's like clearly like a real interest in like focusing on this area of young people within it. I was just thinking, I suppose, as a governance structure, it would be good, I think, to see the young people seen as in a similar way to old people within the structure, in the sense of like they're both interest groups based on specific demographics that therefore have very different like vulnerabilities, interests, like, and even if it might be that the way that we engage with them is different, perhaps if it's meetings or not, but that's totally accepted. But I think within the governance structure, it should be that they sit in the same like accountability framework, if you see what I mean. So I wouldn't like to see one group sort of separated from the internal structures where things get consulted in a representative way, if you see what I mean. So if the governance structures could see those groups equally, I think that makes sense, even if the communication and a way in which you might engage and approach them is slightly different. I think that would be, if there's a recommendation going forward, maybe that would be something that would be nice to have a look at, even though I recognise this is early stages.
Yeah, I think just to build on that before I go to you, Peter, it just from my reading of it, looking at the tenant group strand, there seems, okay, there's a tenant resident forum, so that's people who are living and we're their landlord. Then there's the leasehold forum, and these are just people who have different relationships with us. And then you've got older people, and it might be that there are older people in the leaseholders and the TRA, but it seems a bit weird to have them as that third block if those are the other two groups. But Peter, please come in.
Yes, thank you. I suspect I'm going to add a bit of caution then in that case. My simple reading of things is that in terms of governance, you are dealing with tenants. And by that, we refer to who holds tenancies. And so you will have ordinary tenants, and they may be families, but there'll be a tenant there. And they may be young people in the family, and I'll come back to that. Leaseholders, we all understand that. You will have leaseholder forums. Other places, they normally then refer to sheltered tenants. And that's what they mean by the elderly tenants. But they are still tenants with tenancies. And so in the governance terms, it does refer to speaking to your tenants, i.e. those people with tenancies. I think what we are discussing here, which is, I think, also very correct, is how do we ensure that certain groups within our housing stock are effectively engaged? Now, I think that's a slightly different question about how do we do that effectively. But I think we need to separate out the governance, which is actually who are your tenant holders, your tenancy holders, from your non-tenancy holders, because it's a very different thing in terms of how it is seen in the regulatory context. If we go back to young people, and I agree, there is a lot we can do. And personally, I think we could be doing a lot more for young people on housing estates in our housing stock, because the housing rules does allow us to actually pursue the health and well-being of our young people. Yeah. So I think there's something we can look at in terms of how do we actually engage with them differently, better, and in advancing their well-being. But I would caution about how do we present that in that non-formalized way of governance, which is recognized by the regulatory regime.
Thank you. That's I think that is a helpful point to consider. I guess just while we're on these groups, one thing, I mean, not that, you know, they necessarily need to be, but I wonder, and I know these probably just kind of initial, some of them initial ideas as well. Some of the names of the specific groups, obviously we can't make tenant safety jazzy, but I do feel like maybe there's a bit of scope to build up engagement in terms of, I think a big thing that's come out of this in terms of talking about the Young People's Forum, talking about the work that might be done on estates, is about placemaking and what makes somewhere a home and a community. And I wonder if that would be, you know, it's not kind of a it's a specific group. It's not on kind of, I guess, one of the statutory points, but actually might be quite an interesting thing. That what makes a community, what kind of things do people want, and that can feed in then to future business and plans and various other things. I mean, if we were given sort of a large random sum of money tomorrow with those strings attached, what into it kind of discussions that might also engage young people a bit more, because they don't just need to go to a young person's group either. But Peter.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, because I think I'll try and give the example. So where I worked before in Hounslow, we decided to have a very bespoke initiative, which was our engagement with young people on our estates, in our social housing stock. But we did it as an initiative which was to recognise that they needed that particular attention. And I think that's the conversation we're having here. And what that led us to find out was, what is it they want? What is it we could do to help? And the big message that came through that the housing system, the HRA system, can do to help was to help them with things to do, places to go, or places to go, things to do. And on the back of that, we actually asked them to come forward with initiatives. And two things came out of it. We then they wanted boxing gyms. And they got 2 boxing gyms. They run it. It is the most popular activity on our estates at the moment because they have something to do and a place to go. So they do come out with things that we can say we can support. But I think it does mean designing a slightly different mechanism for engaging them and bringing forward the things they say they would like to do, or where they'll need assistance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think, but I think there's, I guess not, but also a way for us not just to engage young people with that, but other people with that as well. I guess it's a bit of kind of a blue sky committee in a way. It's kind of like here's, and then there might be things that we go, that doesn't fall under tenant safety or strategy or performance, but actually that might be something we can do something about. But I don't know if there's that may be kind of sort of a very unhelpful way to set up a committee, because it's basically inviting people to just come and share anything. But I think the idea would be, more sort of positive and more something in line with, okay, what do our young people want? Maybe something that would be helpful for a lot of people as well. But I don't know, maybe not.
Very good.
Any further comments or questions? Not seeing any. I did have some questions about the tenancy landlord services reorganisation that, as it gets later in the evening, I am totally departing my brain. So actually, yes, here's a good one. What's the time? I don't. So I'm. This is obviously quite a lot of this is quite top level. In a way, what's the sort of time frame for the landlord services transformation work in terms of looking at the roles of different people within the council and how that might look going forward?
Sure. There is a lot of work that has to happen operationally behind the scenes to come to this, but essentially we are aiming for a sort of launch of the reorganization in the new year. So and early in the new year is what I mean when I say that. And these things, do take a number of months, to go through essentially what is a HR process that we would need to follow. So yes, I anticipate, that it will take the early part of next year to carry out that work with a view of, towards spring. I'd use it, that we would be having new structures there'll be a clarity then on new structures.
What might kind of, I guess, proactive management, tenancy management look like? What's sort of the vision for what's the difference, I guess, between how things are working now and what the vision is that will be like after this work's been completed? I guess it's kind of a major shift, but it's also about kind of, I guess, proactive tenant engagement. What does that look like, as opposed to, I guess, the implication of what we're doing now, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so I mean, I would describe the current situation as providing a reactive service. So we as problems arise, we respond and react to those. One of the pieces of work that is already actually underway is, and we haven't done this for a while, but is to sort of two things really. If we work on the premise that a proactive service is a preventative service, it means that the earlier we are able to identify problems that may be escalating with our tenants, and the earlier we are able to intervene, the more likely it is that we would be able to provide a good outcome before maybe a significant crisis is hit. So if we work on that premise, we're carrying out an initial piece of work that essentially involves ringing all our tenants at the moment to update and understand where they are. Some of our tenants have been with us, for 40 years and have barely needed any contact with us actually in that time. That's not to say that all is well. They will have got older in that time. Their needs will have changed. Maybe the people living in their home will have changed. Their children may have left, etc., etc. So us being able to really understand what's happening for our tenants in their lives at the moment would be able to enable us to plan our services in a way that we're able to engage earlier. And actually, some of that work is already underway. We've been piloting for a while that approach, and we're already understanding the people need different things from us, and we've been able to respond to those immediately, rather than wait, for example, for a tenant to maybe be hospitalised, and we only then find out as they come home that they need adaptations, for example. We're able to sort of be able to move into that space earlier. So I think it would look a bit like that. One other example would be if we understand people's vulnerabilities. We have a very good tenancy sustainment offer, but again, the earlier we are able to provide that service, the more likely it is that that tenant is supported early in their needs, and the less likely it is to escalate. So I think you will see shifts along those lines.
And I guess, sorry, Peter, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, just to unpin some of what Nerissa said. So my answer would normally be something which is as simple as we will know our tenants and we'll know their needs. And what that then translates to is that you should find that your tenancy officers should know their tenants. Now that means they need to engage with their tenants, they need to interact with their tenants. Tenancy management shouldn't be about a paper-based way of working. It has to be an interactive way of working. And that's really important, because if, for example, you know your tenants, you will know that actually this household, this issue is brewing. It gives us the opportunity to work with tenants very early before things become a problem. And these things have benefits. If we can actually spot these things before they become major problems, the tenant is better off because we should resolve it quicker, faster, etc. We are better off because it means that we're being more preventative in terms of things that would cost us more downstream. You could nip these things in the bud early. And I think there's so many benefits from simply having a system of tenancy management where you encourage greater interaction between the tenant and the tenancy officers. And I think that's the gauge I would see, that level of engagement.
And will that involve kind of more of a physical presence and engagement in the areas that they potentially cover? So being more present or being kind of proactive in sort of offering out things like advice surgeries or kind of come and have a chat with your tenancy engagement officer? Is that not the kind of thing that you're thinking of? Or can you not answer that at this stage?
I think the tenancy officers will know their tenants and know how best to engage with them. And I think, it should be flexible, because if I'm responsible for a group of tenants, I can have different ways of engaging with them. There'll be one-to-one interactions. I may need to meet with all of them at a certain time. There's an initiative or a state problem. I want to talk to them collectively. So I think there are different ways, and I wouldn't prescribe how you do it. But I think that basic point about you've got to engage with your tenants effectively to know their needs, know the problems they're having, and then knowing where to actually feed that back into the council, back into the office, that actually we can nip things in the bud early.
Fab, thank you. I think that covers off. Oh, yep, Councillor Smith.
I just wanted to add in that I think that it's important perhaps to note that that approach doesn't just apply to tenants and tenancy sustainment and the well-being of tenants, but it's about the local environment on our estates as well. And having that proactive approach, being physically out on estates, it means that the officers are there picking up problems, flagging up problems, not waiting for tenants or councillors to report that there's an issue that needs dealing with. So I hope that will be a benefit of this approach as well, that we'll be much better at that.
Yeah.
And then that will feed back into obviously the earlier strategies we've talked about in terms of proactive management of things or things emerging. I just wonder, because I think this sounds like obviously a lot of our housing stock is on estates, but in areas where there isn't so much where it's a little bit more scattered, or we've got bits in different places. Whether there's, I guess there's a built-in flexibility to the strategy, but whether there's what kind of consideration there is there. I'm selfishly thinking about my own ward here, which has a lot of properties kind of scattered around rather than kind of a main estate, I guess.
Yeah, we're just doing there's an awful lot of work going on in the background at the moment to sort of ready ourselves really. So we're looking at our areas, etc. at the moment to try and sort of sensibly think about how we serve them. So, for example, we would look at issues like that, Councillor Diggins, but we'll also look at density. We look at areas that, have natural estates, and then other areas where you have, densities. If you have a number of tower blocks, for example, those tenants are really quite different and specific. So we're having a look across the whole piece at the moment about how to sensibly, organise ourselves. So, and everybody's needs, will they be different, but they're of equal importance. So we'll consider everything in that round.
And will we as a panel, get a chance to have a sort of, when it's much further along in its progression, would it be possible to have this come back so we could have a look at it again when it's in a little bit, maybe once it's in action or once there's a bit more sort of detail on it?
Yes, I wasn't anticipating in terms of the reorganisation, I think, the purpose of the report is to delegate those authorities so we can progress and start. I would anticipate absolutely that we will kind of continue to engage with councillors, both at ward level actually, but also sort of in these forums around, the work that's being done, the organisation, and of course feedback, because having done these kinds of reorganisations before, it's not something that happens on a certain date and then we're all set. It's an ongoing learning, and that is one of the things I want to build in the culture of the team. Is it's a start of a change process that will never stop. So absolutely, I think we should be continuing that engagement.
Fantastic, thanks very much. I wondered, Councillor Rule, did you want that recommendation that you made earlier to be kept in or put in a slightly different way, or are you happy with Peter's response?
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking on it again, and I suppose perhaps maybe just a reflection of would be useful to kind of put in as a like a reflection of this conversation, I suppose, being put in as a recommendation that, like, recognizing, as you said, Peter, the difference in perhaps regulatory groups in a governance sector, kind of perspective versus engagement of different groups with different interests that might be based on demographics or of other kinds, would be really useful to kind of like have embedded within that, which might mean, for example, your kind of like engagement activities with certain groups that aren't tenants holders, but equally like recognizing if we're filtering representative like if we're creating representative structures, that if we're creating one for one type of demographic, then we should kind of understand why we're creating it for one demographic and not others, perhaps. So I think you like spoke very eloquently earlier, and I sort of just like to kind of recommend that we move in that direction in terms of reflecting on how that sits in the governance structure. I don't know how to word that, but if any thoughts?
Fine for some drafting, it sounds. But yeah, maybe if you and Celeste and I have a conversation over email about how best to word that, but I think something in that spirit,
Sorry.
if everyone did it,
I'm never quite so concise. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, with that, I'd just like to thank Councillor Smith, to Peter, to Neris, for attending and answering all of our questions and being so brilliant and bringing us through very exciting reports. So with that, I will let you go back to your evenings. And for committee members, just to note that there was the agenda, and the next meeting will be on the 6th of March, not the 4th of March. And with that, I think that I can close the meeting. So thanks very much, and thanks to Celeste as well for your help, and have lovely evenings, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good
Night.
evening.
Thank you so much, everybody.